what does a right to freedom of assembly and protest entail? Welcome to the Civics Academy Constitutional Rights series. These videos explore some of our constitutional rights and the institutions designed to support and enforce them. In order to assert our rights, we need to know their meaning and what they include. To use our democratic institutions appropriately, we need to understand their mandate and how they function. In this video, we discuss the scope of the right to assembly, to demonstrate, to picket, and to present petitions peacefully and without carrying of arms as found in Section 17 of the Constitution. We use the term protest to cover all these types of marches and gatherings. The Regulation of Gatherings Act. The Regulation of Gatherings Act sets out how protests should take place. It only applies to gatherings in public places with 15 or more people. The Gatherings Act assumes that all protests are allowed and that they won't be banned due to technicalities. The Gatherings Act requires that the local authority is notified 7 days before the protest is due to take place, if possible. If notice is given less than 48 hours before the start of the protest, it may be prohibited. This aims to help local authorities to ensure that the protest remains peaceful. Even without this notice, it is not automatically illegal to take part in a protest as long as the spontaneous nature of the gathering was genuine. It is, however, a criminal offence to convene and plan protests without giving notice. It is also a criminal offence for protesters to carry dangerous weapons such as sticks, rocks, or guns, and to incite hatred or violence. Where people spontaneously gather to protest, the police must negotiate with the leaders to make sure that the protest remains peaceful. Whenever a protest happens, with or without notice, the authorities may ask the protesters to obey practical, reasonable conditions aimed at reducing traffic disruptions, ensuring people can get to and from work, and preventing injuries and damage of property. Protests can only be banned in the most extreme cases. For example, when there is reliable information that serious disruptions, injury, or damage to property are likely, and when the police cannot protect the public through reasonable restrictions. The Act does require permission for demonstrations near Parliament or the Union buildings. Police must use minimal force. The police must at all costs avoid using force to maintain order amongst protesters. This includes shooting stun grenades and firing rubber bullets. Force may only be a measure of last resort. The police must follow procedures to break up protests and display tolerance to the people involved. Only when protests threaten to become violent and people or property are endangered can the police consider using force. The police must attempt to negotiate with the protesters if there are serious safety risks. The police are allowed to use defensive measures to ensure protesters do not cause harm to people or property. They must give protesters a first warning that minimum force may be applied to disperse them to prevent violence. The protesters must then stop their march. If the protesters do not disperse after a reasonable amount of time, the police can set up measures that are aimed at de-escalating the violence. If this failed, the police must give a second warning and allow people who are not taking part in the protest to leave the area. If after 2 warnings the protest continues and still poses threats, the police may use minimum force to disperse the protesters. Minimum force means that the police are legally prohibited from using unnecessary force or from punishing protesters regardless of the legal status of the march. The purpose is always to diffuse the conflict by using as little force as possible. The degree of force the police can use must match the seriousness of the threats posed. Summary. People have the right to come together to protest and march. Organisers of protests must notify the local authorities, and protesters may not carry weapons. Once a protest takes place, the police must make sure that the protest or march remains peaceful. Police can only use force as a last resort to disperse a protest or march, and only to protect people and property. The police must follow the right procedure to do so.